You're watching Reason and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussion, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome to Reason and Theology, everybody. Your host, Michael Lofton, on a Saturday afternoon, doing our second stream here. And can't guarantee that this will be the last one for today. There will probably be another one this evening, assuming it doesn't rain again and lightning doesn't try to kill me like last night when I was on Pints with Aquinas. And if y'all didn't catch it, check it out. I almost got struck by lightning. It was fun. Anyways, we have Trent Horn, who's going to be joining us here in just a moment. Let me, in fact, what we're going to be doing is a review of his debate with Matt Dillehaunty that he did on the resurrection a couple days ago on Pints with Aquinas. If you haven't watched it yet, please go and watch it. It's very good. But here we're going to do a debrief, if you will. But before I bring him on, let me first again introduce him. Trent is an adjunct professor of apologetics at Holy Apostles College. He has earned master's degrees in the fields of theology, philosophy, and bioethics. He has also written for the National Catholic Bioethics Quarterly and is the author of 9 books, including Answering Atheism and The Case for Catholicism. You can hear Trent frequently on the radio program Catholic Answers Live and on his own podcast, The Council of Trent, which I was on not too long ago. We did a show on sedevacantism, so check that out if y'all get the chance. And of course, he's a returning guest. He was on previously on a roundtable on economics, so it was a very interesting discussion. If y'all haven't seen that one, check it out too. I'll put links there in the description on this YouTube show whenever this posts on live on, well, whenever this posts on YouTube after we're live, I should say. But anyways, debate review with Trent Horn coming up next. Mr. Trent Horn, how are you? Good to have you back on.
Michael, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it was a lot of fun to be on your show before to do the round table. And so, yeah, I thought it'd be a lot of fun to come on your show to talk about this. My debriefs, actually, that's something I had been doing for a while when I was doing debates or dialogues on my own podcast. I would do a debrief afterwards. But I've had a lot more fun in the past few times. I've been doing debriefs with another person just to like kind of get two heads together and talk about it. So I thought it'd be fun to do that with you.
I think it's a good idea, and believe it or not, I enjoy the debrief videos more than the debates themselves. So I really look forward to.
Oh
this
yeah,
one.
you know, it's funny. I love getting people's thoughts on something after it happened. Like, this is just be total randomness. I watched a video the other day online. It's from the actor Jamie Kennedy, and it was kind of his debrief of doing The Son of the Mask, which is like one of the worst movies ever. And like, how could he? Because like The Mask,
is that the sequel to The Mask with Jim Carrey? Okay.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's like The Mask with Jim Carrey is a classic. It's amazing.
Right.
And then they had Jamie Kennedy. They're like, you could make like millions of dollars if you do The Son of the Mask, and it's just horrible. And he like explains like, that's a lot of people, and those who have wish they hadn't. But yeah, you're right. When people do things, sometimes it's a lot of fun just to then sit with them, be like, so why'd you do that? Or how did this happen? Or even like debates, like we'll watch the debate. Then I love hearing people later, like, so how do you think that went? What do you think? And then maybe even to get some of the inside story, which there's a little bit more of inside story for this one actually too, a little bit of one.
Yeah, and before we dive into the inside aspect, let me just get your overall thoughts. How do you think the thing went overall? Are you happy with it? Dissatisfied? What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, so background for your listeners. So Matt Dillehaunty is an atheist who has hosted a show on YouTube. He's based in Austin, Texas. He's just a few hours away from me. And the show is called The Atheist Experience. So it's sort of like an atheist Catholic Answers Live, where people call in, atheists, a lot of Christians and other theists will call in and engage Matt on issues. And Matt has kind of developed a reputation of saying it like it is. And sometimes he gets abrasive or aggressive with callers. And I think it is a reputation he has leaned into, that he even kind of leaned into when we we're getting ready for the debate, the 5 minutes before, Matt Fradd was talking to us about cross-examination and what it would be like. So I think he takes pride in kind of that feeling. And I've seen him debate previous Christians on he's done a lot of debates, by the way. He's probably done dozens of them, more debates than I've done at this point. And he's done more debates on the resurrection. This is my first debate just on the resurrection. He's done, I'd say, at least 4 debates on the subject. And so we came together to debate it. And I think overall it went well. And it went well in the sense, Michael, that my goal in the debate was just to not look foolish. I kind of had a low... It's always, if you just set the bar low enough, you can always feel good about what you do.
I know what you mean. That's how I've done in my debates. I just don't want to be... If I can hold the thesis, that's great. But at least let me not look like a fool.
but exactly. Because here's the thing. I have, going into this debate, I study my debater before I go into the subject. It was actually funny. I was debating Dan Barker at the University of Minnesota a few years ago. And at the campus Newman Center, I spoke with some Catholics there before I did the debate. And there were some Catholic members of the football team who were there, and they were talking to me like, you do debates, that's really cool. Like, they said, how do you prep? And I said, well, you guys are on the football team, do you ever watch videos of the other teams before you play them? Right. And they said, oh yeah, we do that all the time. Right. And I said, well, I do that too. I watch videos. If my opponent has done debates before, specifically on the topic we're debating, I will study that in and out. If they've written something, I'll go through their book inside and out. But especially in their debates, even if it's not just a book, because sometimes in a debate, there'll be a certain well-worn argument or piece of rhetoric they're fond of using. And so the more you can decrease the amount of times you're surprised by something, if you can see something coming, then you have a better chance of formulating a response. So I'd study his previous debates. He's debated Mike Winger, who is a Protestant pastor. In fact, I think Matt, I think he's rarely, if ever, actually debated a Catholic on these issues. Usually it's Protestant apologists. So he debated Mike Winger on the resurrection, a Protestant pastor in California who I've engaged his criticisms of Catholicism. He debated Mike Licona, who is one of the best one of the best apologists in general, writing on the resurrection today. Right. So that one was especially textbook to look at. He's debated Blake Junta, who is a very good apologist. He's in the Protestant tradition as well. But I watched those debates, and I felt like Matt did better in them because Matt is not an intellectual. So Matt is, some people who will do apologetics or something, they're fencers. Matt is a boxer. Like, people have made this comparison with me and other people. It's, that I'm more precise in what I'm trying to go for. And so Matt, he slugs. He can have an aggressive, abrasive personality. He's very good with rhetoric. He's very clever. I think before, he used to be a Southern Baptist, and many people said he could have been a pastor. And when you listen to the debate, he has a pleasant voice. He's good at speaking and putting his thoughts together. He's easy to listen to. He certainly could have been if anything, Matt Dillehaunty is kind of a pastor of atheism. Yeah, I mean, if you think about it.
I did notice very different dispositions between you two. You were very calm and objective the entire time. He seemed to go off the rails a few times. He seemed to get heated and lose some objectivity.
Well, I want to talk about that. So I had seen Matt, and in previous debates, he uses that to his advantage, that he turns up his anger at someone and puts forward a bold, indignant claim. Like, he'll say, you didn't present evidence for the resurrection. You just presented claims, and claims are not evidence. And the Christian is just kind of like deer in the headlights. One, because somebody's yelling at him. And then two, they say something that sounds maybe correct, but they know deep down it's not correct. And they just can't quite articulate on the spot why it isn't correct. And when Matt can land blows like that, it goes very well for him. So, and I saw him do that in previous debates. And in drafting my opening statement, I saw in previous debates what the Christian apologists did was they packed their opening statement with just history. Here's like my 100 historical evidences for the resurrection. And they put it out there. And what Matt Dillehaunty does is he just goes skepticism. We can't know anything about history. Eyewitness, hearsay. And he throws all this skeptical arguments out there. And all of the historical arguments from the Christian just kind of evaporate. I know in one debate, the Christian was trying to show that Luke Acts is reliable because it got a lot of details right about ancient Greco-Roman history, and it did. And so then that gives us reliability to the testimony of the apostles, then back to the resurrection. And Matt just said, who cares if it got shipping lane schedules right? It doesn't prove Jesus rose from the dead. And it's like, dude, man, you're not letting him make his whole case. So that's why I actually, with Matt Dillehaunty, it's not about arguing history. It's arguing epistemology. It's arguing, how do we know what we know? So that's why the debate's resolution was, it is reasonable to believe Jesus rose from the dead. I wasn't even arguing that this is what happened. I'm just saying it's reasonable for people to believe that. So my opening statement, the majority of it was just, here's how a belief is reasonable. And I gave 3 rules for, here's how you know something's reasonable, how it disqualifies other beliefs, not the resurrection. I gave some historical evidence for the resurrection. I gave a short argument for the existence of God to make the resurrection more plausible. So I think in doing that, and then in my exchanges with him, my goal was just to show that Matt's epistemology is it doesn't work because it leads us to rejecting too many false beliefs or to be arbitrary towards miracles and things like that. So overall, I think it went well. I thought it would have gone much better. I originally thought the format was going to be, standard openings, rebuttal rounds, and then a short cross-examination. I didn't read the fine print. So like 5 minutes before the debate happened, I saw that, oh, never mind, we're not doing rebuttals. We're doing a 40-minute discussion period. Matt Fradd added the element into it of letting us have 8 minutes of cross, where it's not free discussion. It's one person gets to ask the questions and is allowed or encouraged to interrupt the other, which I think lit the fuse for Matt to get. No, it's interesting. When I was doing cross, I did not get belligerent with him. I think he started getting belligerent because previous Christians have just tried to convince him of the resurrection in the middle of the debate. And that plays to his strengths because he can just say, well, I'm not convinced by your evidence. My strategy was more to show that Matt's position is unreasonable and he makes unreasonable assumptions, which is why I asked him questions, not open-ended questions. I asked him questions like, you say resurrections don't happen. How many have you investigated?
Right. I remember that. Yeah.
And he said, so go ahead.
Well, there was also a point where he kept cutting. He asked you a question and he kept cutting you off when you were trying to give an answer. Do you recall that part?
Yes, I do. And this was what it's funny reading in the comments section over some atheists. They say Trent Horn lost the debate when he said he would believe miracles based on testimony. I'm like, yeah, but I gave an argument.
Respond to that, because he was basically saying that's ridiculous. You could never have a claim like the resurrection or any breaking of the laws of nature as he sees it. You could never have that based upon testimonies. Maybe interact with that a little.
Right. And so this is essentially his argument. And it's similar. And basically, he was quoting David Hume. That Hume's argument was that if it's a choice between believing the laws of nature have been suspended or violated and believing testimony, you're only justified in believing testimony if it would be a greater miracle that the testimony were false. And so that's why Matt was saying something like, he kept saying something, I didn't quite get what he was saying. He was saying, I'm not saying believe the lesser miracle. I'm saying reject the greater miracle. And so I think what he was trying to say is, I'm only going to believe in testimony for a miracle if it's even more miraculous that the testimony would be false. And that's basically Hume's argument. Of course, there's a few things wrong with that. One, why would I believe then we shift the question back one. Okay, I won't believe in the miracle. In order to believe in miraculous events, I would need miraculous testimony. The idea that if it were false, it would be a greater miracle. Well, this really weird, odd testimony, why should I believe that testimony? Well, then I need more testimony for that testimony. Why would I believe these things? So it creates a kind of infinite regress problem. And number two, even in Hume's own time, there were people who offered rebuttals to him. This is a famous one in the literature that I think Hume weakly responded to. And the reply to from Hume's critics was, well, Mr. Hume, what if a British sailor went to, and this is, Hume is several hundred years ago, a British sailor goes to Polynesia and he meets the Polynesian natives. And he tells them about how in the winter time, or in winter in England, you can walk across a lake. Are the Polynesians, should they believe him? Well, in Polynesia, you've never seen anything freeze, ever. No one ever has in the entire history of their culture. So that would seem that testimony violates it, and no testimony could overcome that presumption. And yet, following that methodology, you would believe a falsehood as a result, instead of just believing testimony that's reliable. The other example I gave in the debate were black swans. The term black swan for 1,500 years referred to impossibility. It didn't refer to unlikelihood. It was like, oh, that's as impossible as a black swan, because it was taken as an axiom. Swans are white. And in Europe, they all were. In 1697, black swans were discovered in Australia. I've seen black swans. I got right up to them. They can get a little aggressive, but I've seen them with my own eyes in Perth. And so there it would be like, well, wait a minute. Let's say you come back, you have a shipload of people, and they all say, yeah, we held him, we saw him, we touched him, we saw this black swan. By Hume's maxim, couldn't possibly believe it, because we've got thousands of years of experience of never seeing them. Now, some atheists will say a black swan is nothing like a resurrection. Well, no, because the difference they may say is, well, one's a violation of natural laws, one isn't. To which I would say, well, what are natural laws? Natural laws are just descriptions of things typically bear out. Like, there's no law of gravity that drives around in a natural law police car that's like, slow down, you can't float up there. It's just, they're descriptions. Laws of nature are shorthand ways of us saying this is how things tend to go. So the idea here is, if you're saying that miracles are you can't believe in miracles, or there's no evidence for miracles because they violate the way things always tend to go, well, then white swans are the way things always tend to go. And there's other examples I could bring up. So the fact that something is not frequent, or even has never been observed, there can be sufficient testimony to overcome that. And what's ironic about Matt Dillehaunty is he often says claims are not evidence, which I'd love to get in with you later here in the show, why that is demonstrably false. He'll say claims are not evidence, to which I will say to him, you're saying that no testimony can show a miracle has happened. That is a claim. Why should I believe that? Rather, it seems to me a certain amount of testimony could. The question is, where do we draw that line? And Matt, and many people notice this, the weakness in his position, he could never say where that line was, because he's already decided, you can never believe in a miracle.
One thing that I noted from him that I thought was interesting, and I'd like to hear a response to, is he effectively said, look, God knows what would convince me. Matt Dillehaunty, he knows what would convince me, and he hasn't offered that proof to me. What would you say in response to that?
Yeah, it's a rhetorically effective thing, because we think to ourselves, yeah, God knows what would convince someone. So why doesn't God provide convincing evidence? What Matt does with this short kind of rhetoric is he's basically just throwing out there without defense a certain problem, an atheistic argument. This would be the problem of divine hiddenness. God doesn't exist because if he existed, we would all know about it. But there's some reasonable people who don't, therefore God doesn't exist. And it's really a subset of the problem of evil. If God existed, there would be no evil. There is evil, so there's no God. The problem with the problem of evil is, well, could God have good reasons for allowing evil? Well, yeah, we can think of a bunch. Free will, having a universe, of natural laws, of developing virtue. The same thing happens with non-belief. If God existed, there would be no non-belief. Well, I could say, well, could God have good reasons for allowing non-belief? And the burden is on the atheist to show God has none of these good reasons, which is ironic, because many atheists will say, you can't say a miracle happened because there could be some unknown natural thing we're not aware of. But then, so the atheists will be humble to say there could be an unknown natural thing that explains what we observe. where they're not willing to say God could have a reason for allowing evil or allow non-belief. And I can think of reasons. Maybe God wants us to have the good of evangelizing people. Maybe God wants to kind of keep his distance so we can reach out to him in relationship rather than feeling like he's kind of looking over our shoulders telling us what to do all the time. And so here, when it comes to evidence, to say, well, the question is not, has God provided convincing evidence for Matt Dillehaunty? Because what convinces someone is based on their own rational biases, and they could be acting irrationally. Rather, has God left sufficient evidence for a reasonable person? Because the thing is, well, what would convince Matt Dillehaunty? I don't know. I'm not in Matt Dillehaunty's head. I made an argument of what is sufficient evidence for just a reasonable person to believe things. And here's the other problem with Matt. When you ask him, God would know. It's an assumption that Matt says, I don't know what would convince me. God knows. And so then he should provide that. Well, what I would say to that is, is it possible for Matt? I would just ask the question: is it possible nothing would convince him? Is that possible? It seems like if he can't say what would convince him, it's certainly a live possibility. The answer is nothing. And so, if the idea here is that God is omniscient, he does know everything. But like in set theory in mathematics, we have empty sets, a set that has no members. So it could be the set of things that would convince Matt Dillehaunty is empty. There is nothing. God can't know something that doesn't exist. So it'd be like saying, I don't know how to draw a square circle, but God knows how to draw a square circle. And if God came down here and he drew a square circle, then I would believe he existed. You say, well, no, not even God can do that, because that doesn't really exist. And that's why I kept asking Matt, well, what would convince you? And he, to date, has never provided anything, because Matt has said in other debates that this form of reasoning is fallacious. You can't say, I don't know the natural cause, therefore it is supernatural. And I agree that in some cases that's bad reasoning, but not always. If we have demonstrated something is naturally impossible, then we can say that it's supernatural. If we've demonstrated with certainty natural impossibility. But for Matt, anything that he could come up with as a hypothetical example end up going from ignorance to belief in the supernatural, which he already says that you can't do. So I think that he has set, and it's clear in the debate, he has set a barrier too high to go over. But not even just that, Michael. What he has done, and I tried to show in the debate that I think went well, is to show that, especially not just believing like God exists, but that God revealed himself in history. Matt he is very agnostic towards history. That because he only believes in like what science can show in the here and the now, in the debate, he had to say he doesn't know if historical events take place. He even said he refused to say that it was reasonable to believe Jesus was crucified. And so if you notice in that question, I did not ask him, Matt, do you think Jesus was crucified? Because I don't care what Matt thinks about that issue. In the context of a debate, I'm just saying, is it reasonable for somebody else to believe this fact, which is a fact that is taught by every scholar teaching at a major university today? And then Matt got mad if you noticed, he said, he didn't like that I phrased it that way. He said, what does it matter if they teach at a major university? Because there are people with PhDs like Robert Price and Richard Carrier who don't think Jesus existed. I included the major university thing, and I wasn't trying to single out Price and Carrier, but to say, look, it's a lot harder to be employed as a tenure track professor at a university than it is to just get a PhD. There are people who can plug away at a PhD program and then just become crackpots. Just because you have a PhD, that just means and in some cases, all it means is you wrote a really long term paper. So it does show you've done a lot of research. But to me, there are people who can plug away. And I mentioned in the debate to find common ground, there are young Earth creationists who have PhDs in astronomy and geology who think Earth is 6,000 years old. So so that's why I said to him, to show for Matt, look, Matt, your position, you're so agnostic towards history. You're saying all of the scholars, all of the major scholars, not just in the New Testament, because some atheists will say, well, of course New Testament scholars believe Jesus existed just like Harry Potter scholars believe in Harry Potter. I'm like, that is a dopey analogy. I mean, you and I know this. Like, what we've taught, there are New Testament scholars who are atheists, who are super liberal. It's this idea, like, if you're a New Testament scholar, you're some fundamentalist Christian. I would say New Testament scholars are more likely to be theologically liberal. Honestly, I don't know if that's your opinion.
Oh yeah, I agree.
They're way more, and it's not. There's this idea among the atheist community that New Testament scholars are like shackled by like statements of faith, and the church has told them all what to believe, and that's not true, because I would say the majority of New Testament scholars, even among ones who believe like Jesus rose from the dead, the majority of them believe that many of the Pauline epistles are pseudonymous. They would, are more apt to, it's not like they all think that Paul wrote all these letters or, other aspects in New Testament studies, or they think the gospel, they reject traditional authorship of the gospels. So it's not a bunch of fundamentalist Christians, but they all at least agree, especially among the atheist ones, but not just New Testament scholars, historians, classicists, it's just a world fact that, Jesus was crucified. And for Matt to say, well, I don't think it's reasonable to believe that, I wanted people to see, look, if you follow Matt's methodology, if you follow it, you will embrace a crank position. And I don't think he wanted to say, yeah, it's reasonable. I wanted him to hopefully say that because, one, it's true. And then two, I wanted him to say it's reasonable because if he had said it was reasonable to believe Jesus was crucified, I would have asked him, why is that reasonable? And he would have had to say, well, because there are ancient documents. And if he's only relying on Josephus and Tacitus, it's not eyewitness. It's it's secondhand, written decades later, written 60, 70, 80 years later, so which the New Testament is better. If it is if he had said, and I think maybe that's why he didn't want to say it, Michael, honestly, because the way I was going to argue the resurrection was basically this route. To prove Jesus rose from the dead, you just got to get three facts. Jesus was seen alive, he died, he was seen to be dead, and he was seen alive again. So it's like the first two, everybody, that's scholarship. He's alive, then he was dead. So if it's reasonable to believe that people who saw him when he was alive, we can trust those accounts, what about the people who said he was alive after his death? That's what we need to get to. And he didn't want to go anywhere near that.
Now, on that, from what I did recall, he said something at least related to it. He was effectively saying that, okay, maybe some of these people who claim to see Jesus resurrected, maybe they weren't lying, but it could just be that they were sincerely mistaken. What would you say in response to that?
Sure. And I think that the idea that the apostles were actively lying, that is a minority view. I mean, you really only see that hypothesis among late 19th century German form critics, but not even all of them. Now, there's some like the Passover plot from the 1960s. There are some people who hold the disciples were fraudulent. But the problem with that theory, you go all the way back to even in the 19th century, David Strauss and Bultmann and others, that it doesn't make sense for the apostles to do that because what they said is what do these people have to gain? Normally, when you carry out a lie and you deceive people on a massive scale, you do so for personal gain. So when I think of Mormonism, for example, like, well, Trent, how do you explain Joseph Smith? You say, well, Joseph Smith could have deceived himself. It's possible. But it's also possible Joseph Smith was a charlatan. What does he have to gain? I don't know, 40 wives, as he's starting this religion and power amongst this community that was really growing in 19th century America. But among the disciples, what they have to gain is martyrdom. Now, there's a few ways atheists do reply to this. One way to reply is they'll say, well, maybe it was a noble lie. Maybe they thought it was worth this persecution because it's a noble lie that they're sharing to the world, and that's important. But that would have not made sense to the apostles. The noble lie, it's like what they're saying is, because Christ is risen, we know we have confidence in the resurrection of the dead. And that's their argument. But if they're lying about the resurrection part, then there's nothing noble about it. They're not trying to get people to become moral and virtuous. You already had Judaism to do that. You already had Judaism to show people how to be moral and virtuous. You had the golden rule that Jesus cited in the Sermon on the Mount. That's from Leviticus 19. Jesus expanded it to include everyone. But you already had a way of living to show people more morals and virtue. So the noble lie, it's like, what's the thing we're sharing? It's like these liberal Christian views. Well, it's faith and hope and rising to a new creation. It's word babble. It would have not made sense to them. There's nothing noble about this lie that they're sharing. And number two, it doesn't make sense to them to lie because the Jesus tradition condemned lying. Let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. So it would just go with the core of what they're trying to share with others. Now, other atheists will say, well, how do we know that they're martyred? How do we know that they were even given a chance to recant? Well, the letter of Pliny the Younger to Emperor Trajan, in there, Pliny was saying, what do I do with these Christians? People don't like them. Trajan says, give them an opportunity to repent. And then, we got my little guy.
Oh, I know how that is. My son always wants to come in. Every time I go live, he starts knocking on the door.
Totally. Hey, mister, I'll be on in a little sec, okay? Thank you, mister. I always try to remember to lock that above there.
Look, I even have the door locked, and he still wants to sit there and just bang on it.
Totally. But the interesting thing on lying, though, we do have evidence that they could have recanted, but more than that, they were willing to be persecuted. Even if you don't show martyrdom and execution, which we have good evidence for from the church fathers, at least for Peter, Paul, and James. What you have is, they're willing. Paul said, Paul was a persecutor, and he says, I have been whipped. I have been stoned. They're willing to endure this. Now, what then atheists will say is, yeah, but so what? There are Muslims who will fly into the World Trade Center. What does that prove? The willingness to be persecuted is not proof of the truth of what you're arguing. It's proof you sincerely believe it. Now, you could have been mistaken. So you're saying maybe they were mistaken. And I rebutted that they hallucinated in my opening statement. And Matt never challenged that in the debate, by the way. He never challenged my arguments against them hallucinating. The only thing he tried to offer was, do you believe in Elvis sightings? Do you believe people saw Elvis? If you don't believe people when they said they saw Elvis, why would you believe people who said that they saw Jesus? And to which my reply is, okay, well, what is the evidence for Elvis sightings? And what happens sometimes, Michael, in these debates, which I tried to prepare for, was Matt will bring up these examples. And the Christian apologist has sometimes never heard of them or never looked into them. And he's not sure how to respond. And so to which I would say, well, no, I had even more I would have talked about with Elvis if he wanted to. The first Elvis sighting was on the day of his death at Memphis, Tennessee. Somebody thought they saw him at the airport getting on a plane to Buenos Aires. But then the story falls apart because Memphis airport at that time had no international flights. So like this, just it falls apart. And but the same thing that and other accounts. Well, there's an easy explanation for Elvis sightings: mistaken identity. The people who claim to see Elvis are not his friends, not his family members. It's fans. It's people who, maybe that guy, they think they see Elvis, but they don't have none of these interactions. It's not an extended interaction with somebody. It's like, I saw him at the airport or I saw him at Legoland. But then the other thing is there are people walking around impersonating Elvis. So of course you're going to have mistaken identity when there's Elvis impersonators running around, but you have nothing like that for Jesus. There's no Jesus impersonators in the first century unless they want to get crucified. And the people who claim to see Jesus had extended conversations with him, and they are friends and family members who can tell the difference. Now, there are some cases where because Jesus has his glorified body, they don't recognize him. And that may be Jesus because he has a different type of control over his body because it is now a glorified, resurrected body, or he is able to do something to prevent them from seeing him, to cloak himself, if you will. That's always temporary, though. And then he reveals who he is to them. But it's just not the case. Mistaken identity just doesn't apply. And finally, even if it did, even if it's like, we thought it was Jesus, if you met someone who looked like Jesus, you still wouldn't come to the belief in resurrected glorious life unless they were able to ascend into heaven and they had other features of the resurrected body. You would just come to believe Jesus had survived death, not that he had risen gloriously from it.
Yeah. Now, one thing that I wanted to briefly touch on, it's a little off track, but it did come up in the debate. And I found it interesting. He brought up the claim that the New Testament passage that talks about Jesus cursing the fig tree, this is somehow evidence he wasn't a divine figure, that he would curse a fig tree. What's going on there? Any comments on that when he brought that up?
Well, I didn't even. I think he did it in a time when I wasn't able to respond to him.
Right.
And even if he had brought it up in his arguments, I probably would have not even addressed it, because it has absolutely nothing to do. Jesus didn't rise from the dead because one time he cursed a fig tree. But it has absolutely no logical force whatsoever. So I probably would have just ignored it, or said has no logical force, and I would just ignore it. But people bring this up. Dan Barker brings this up as like, he threw a temper tantrum because he was hungry and he was upset. And people, especially somebody like Dan Barker or Matt Dillehaunty, like, I can understand an atheist who has not read religion very much saying something like this. But for somebody who claims, like Dan Barker, who used to be a pastor, for someone who claims that they used to be a pastor or used to be a Bible scholar or used to always, love the Bible and study it, to make that kind of conclusion, you either have to evince gross ignorance or gross deception. That
you should know better.
It's like, read, if you don't know what, I don't understand this Bible story. There are a gazillion commentaries you can read. Read a commentary and see what is the point here. And the point is that Jesus is using the fig tree. He goes there. There were leaves to show that there should have been fruit, but there was an outward sign of fruit, but no fruit.
Right.
And so he destroyed it. And it's a lesson. Why? Because Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. There are outward signs of piety, but inward, the religious leaders are like whitewashed tombs. They're spiritually alive in their ritual, spiritually dead in their hearts. And because of that, judgment will come to them in 40 years with the destruction of Jerusalem. That's the point Jesus is making. And to not be aware of this basic element of biblical exegesis, it just shows, what you're dealing with here sometimes. And it's sad.
It was. I was surprised that he was that ignorant, that he brought that up and didn't actually know that this was something that's supposed to point you to something else.
Well, he has said other things in debate, Michael, that have been astoundingly ignorant. In his debate with Mike Winger on the resurrection, he said there are no contemporary accounts of the resurrection. And I would say, well, what does that mean? If you mean there was nothing written when the resurrection took place, sure. But by that standard, we have no contemporary accounts of anything in ancient history. Absolutely nothing. We have no contemporary accounts of anything in ancient history, but we don't throw out ancient history. And then he said, so I didn't know if that's what he meant, okay. But then he said, well, the closest we have is Clement, because he was at least born then. And I wish if I had been in the debate, I would have asked Matt, who's Clement? What are you? I mean, I know what First Clement is, and who Clement. That Clement was, the the successor of Saint Peter, Linus Cleus Anacletus Clement IV. So I always get messed up whether you're the fourth successor or not. So he would be the fourth pope, the third successor to Saint Peter. And he's
different on different lists too, from what I've seen as well.
Right. So whether he is the Pope when he was writing First Clement, or he might have been an elder at the church at Rome, he was a corresponding secretary writing for the elders at the church at Rome. That's a different debate about First Clement. So he's writing sometime between 60 and 90, depending on how you're going to date it. Matt, what are you talking about? That's like our contemporary earliest source. Our earliest source are the letters of Paul.
Right.
And the earliest source in them are the creeds that he contains in places like 15.
Which predate Paul. At least the writings predate him.
Oh, absolutely. 1 Corinthians 15 has been dated. Some people have dated it to within months of the resurrection. And so what's hard is, Matt, and I get frustrated, Michael, but it's a frustration of sadness that, like, I want atheists, even atheists that are very rude on the internet, to come to know Jesus Christ. And so it's maddening to me. They are ensnared and kept from Christ by very simple errors. Like, for example, if you can't prove it outside of the Bible, I'm not going to believe it.
Is it that though? Because I honestly think if you could correct these things, I think that some of them still won't believe.
No, you're right. It is a matter of the heart.
Yeah.
I do think that the arguments or slogans are the veneer, but sometimes you have to crack through the veneer before you can really start drilling. So I mean, I agree with you that it's, in a lot of cases, it's not like a simple thing, but it is maddening. I guess here's the maddening frustration. Their hearts have been hardened. Want to pray for them, want to help them be open to coming to know our Lord. But like when other Christians want to engage in them, they can put up a barrier with these sound bites that many Christians don't know how to properly respond to. And so they don't have to be confronted with the deeper issue if they can rely on this soundbite deflection. And so that's what I guess frustrates me when it's like, no, let's go past your soundbite. Another one is you can't cite the Bible to prove the Bible. And so it's like, well, that's correct. For example, I can't prove God exists by citing a verse that says God exists. Maybe some Christians do that. I'm not convinced, but there might be some who do that. Fine. But in the context of ancient history, like if you think every ancient document, the only way we can prove it is by finding another ancient document that says it's correct, you have the infinite regress problem all over again. Because then how do you know that document's correct? Actually, Pope Leo XIII talked about this 100 years ago in his encyclical on biblical errancy, because he's writing at the end of the 19th century, and so he was writing this when German form critics are all trying to undermine the Bible. And he said in his encyclical on biblical inerrancy, he said that one of the errors is that the Bible is considered suspect, but profane, i.e. secular works, are always assumed to be accurate. Like, I'll give you an example. So sometime during the reign of Emperor Claudius, sometime after 41 AD, Claudius expelled all of the Jews from Rome, kicked them all out of Rome because they were rioting about somebody named Chrestus, probably a fight among Jews and Christians about Christ. How do we know this happened? It's not recorded in Josephus. It's not recorded in Tacitus. It's not recorded in Philo. It's only recorded in two sources. It's recorded in Suetonius and one other source, Luke. Acts 18, Paul says he met Aquila and Priscilla. They had come from Rome because Claudius expelled the Jews. If Suetonius had not recorded this detail, every atheist would say, look at this thing that Luke totally botched. Claudius never did this. Luke didn't know what he was talking about. But Luke did. Luke got it right when Josephus and Tacitus got it wrong, and thankfully Suetonius was there. But it just shows you these ancient historians didn't get everything right. They contradicted themselves. They forgot to record events. And so the New Testament gets held to a way different standard that atheists and skeptics will discount the New Testament, but then treat ancient history like it's weirdly inspired. It's hard to see the kind of ignorance towards history and historiography that's on display, and I want to disabuse people of that ignorance.
Now, he also touched on, comparing the claims of the Christians to other paranormal things and claims. Can you maybe touch on that briefly?
Yeah, and this is once again standard for Matt. So his argument, and I've actually thought about writing a whole book on this. I may actually start soon, now that I'm done with this debate and done with other projects I'm working on. The atheist argument, it kind of goes like this. If the arguments that lead to believing in the resurrection also lead to believing in other things like alien abductions or the Book of Mormon or ghosts or demons, or, if it leads to you believing these other false things, then those arguments for the resurrection aren't good. Because if that reasoning style, if it gives you not just resurrection, but like other miracles in other religions or other paranormal things that are allegedly false, then those arguments of the resurrection aren't good. So I have, three thoughts on that. One, the claims they make about the arguments of the resurrection are false in two ways. One, they try to say it leads to things that are false. They claim they don't exist, but they haven't shown that. It's like, if you believe in the resurrection, are you also going to believe in apparitions or ghosts or demons? Like, well, why not? I mean, I'm not going to believe every ghost story or every case of demonic possession, but I would ask the atheist, how do you know that they're all false? You're basically assuming they're all false. How do you know that? Why should I believe your claim? Or even aliens? Like in the debate, Matt and I both said it's plausible there's aliens in the universe. They may not have gotten to Earth, but it's a big universe. So if that's the case, how do we know they haven't made a pit stop here? I'm not saying they have, but you can't just say, oh, it could lead to these false things. We haven't proven that they're false. Number two would be trying to say that the evidence is the same. Like, oh, if you believe in Jesus, why don't you also believe in the Book of Mormon? Well, the Book of Mormon is way different. The Book of Mormon does contradict facts in ancient history. Now, I will say this with you, Michael, that I think some Christian apologists, when they go after like the Quran or the Book of Mormon, they must be careful. You be careful to not do things like, look at this contradiction in the Book of Mormon, therefore the Book of Mormon is false. Dude, you know how many people say our contradictions are in the Bible?
Right.
So it's like, if you're going to go after the text, you got to go after a weakness that the Bible does not have itself. So like with the Book of Mormon, the one that I would go after is this. If you take the Bible, even if you give it to like Bart Ehrman and Hector Avalos and skeptical scholars, even a bunch of atheist scholars, given the Bible, I could say to them, where do these events allegedly take place? Now, they may not say, they might say there wasn't a miracle or even deny some of the stories, but they could at least tell you, well, Jerusalem is here and Galilee is here and Jesus went this route down through here, all of that. Book of Mormon scholars cannot do that with the Book of Mormon. They don't even agree where the Book of Mormon takes place in the New World. Some of them think it was North and South America entirely. Some think it's a little strip of land in Central America. Some people think it's like by the Great Lakes is where these events took place. That is it'd be like imagine if we had the Bible and we were telling about Jesus and Jesus did these things. And people asked us, where was Jesus crucified? Like, well, he was crucified on Golgotha. Golgotha could be in Israel. It might be in South Africa. It could be outside Moscow. We're not entirely sure. Like, it'd be very hard to take it seriously. This is a historical account. But that so that's why I think to say no, the evidences are very different. I have a third point, unless you wanted to add something else.
Well, I mean, just a quick follow up there. Aren't there some things, and it's either Tobit or Judith, I forget offhand, but that it sounds like the author is not accurate in their geographical description. Could you maybe briefly address that, because people are going to bring that up?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Also, we have to look at the genre of the text. So I think it's more usually, I don't know if it's geography, though I will say that, you're worried some Protestants might bring this up.
Correct.
Well, here's the other problem that comes here. There are these other alleged errors in the Bible as well, but I don't think that they're as wide a magnitude. So, I mean, Mark, there's, when is it the Gerasenes or the land of the Gergesenes, where Jesus goes across the lake? There's a bit of discrepancy there, but not as wide. But in Tobit and Judith, I don't know if it's geography. More so, you have Judith talking about things happening during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, saying like Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Assyria when he was king, when he's the king of Babylon. Everybody knows that. Things that appear to be in Tobit and Judith, things that appear to be outright anachronisms. To which, in my book, The Case for Catholicism, I talk about this at length in Case for Catholicism, and I cite Protestant commentaries on Judith and Tobit who say, well, these inaccuracies, these anachronisms are intentional because Tobit and Judith. Now, I mean, Catholics can take a different view. Some Catholics try to say that they're writing history and this is what they're trying to do, and there's an explanation. Another view, among especially you look at Protestant scholars who are not trying to attack Catholicism, they say, well, Tobit and Judith are works of didactic fiction. So they're not trying to get. In fact, that the fact that Judith is saying, when the Jews went against fought King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Assyrians, that would be like Judith itself is a title. It means Lady Jew. Like if I showed you a comic book, or I showed you a book, and I said, Michael, what genre do you think this is? And the book is called The Story of When Miss America Fought Hitler and Kept Him from Invading with the Soviet Union. And it's like how Miss America stopped Hitler and the Soviet army from taking over America. You'd say, this sounds like an interesting kind of comic book fiction. And right. Actually, Carey Moore, in his Anchor Bible commentary series on Judith, said that the author of Judith, after writing the inaccuracy and the anachronisms, would have winked to his audience after writing it, if he was reading it to them in person. So you're right, the genre has to go into account, but the Book of Mormon, its genre is supposed to be, it's not didactic fiction. The Book of Mormon attests to be a historical account of events that actually took place in the New World. It's not trying to be didactic fiction of any kind, which, by the way, the Bible, you also, when you compare the Bible and the Book of Mormon, it's not a fair, the Book of Mormon does have, the different books in it do claim to have been written by different authors, all of the series of books that are put together, but they generally try to ascribe a historical narrative about ancient Jews leaving Assyria and coming over to the New World. And so, yeah, it's true that, when you're addressing that, so the atheists will say Christianity and Mormonism have the same evidential value. So, this shows the arguments for the resurrection are bad. And I would say, no, I would say the evidential value is different, but I'm going to try hard not to straw man the Mormon position. I will look at what is their best arguments, but it's just way different. It is different. Like, to give you another example, in Mormonism, part of their standard works, one of their inspired works is something called the Book of Abraham. It purports to be a retelling of the Book of Genesis, but it has plural gods and, things like that in it, not like in Genesis. But also it includes in it a facsimile, a reproduction of a papyrus containing hieroglyphics. This was something that Joseph Smith acquired at a fair, I think it was sometime in the 1830s. And Smith claimed he was able to translate this with the help of the Urim and the Thummim, the seer stones, and that this ancient papyrus told the story of Abraham. And so then when Egyptologists look at the facsimile, the copy of it, they said, no, it doesn't. And the problem is, so then the Mormon apologists said, well, that's the facsimile. You need to look at the original. The context of the original might have shown us it really did, but it was lost. It was thought to have been lost for decades. It was rediscovered, I think, at the Metropolitan Art Museum or at a museum. I think it was the Met, like in the 1960s or something like that. And so Egyptologists, Mormon and non-Mormon, were able to examine it and conclude the original papyrus had nothing to do with Abraham. So which Mormons have now had to say, well, Joseph wasn't really trying to translate it. He was doing something else. And the evidence, we could have done a whole show on Mormonism, I guess. But it's important for apologists when atheists say your standards of evidence would lead to these other belief systems. No, it doesn't. I have examined these belief systems, but they try to say, well, you're just discounting them because you don't belong to them. No, I have looked at them, but I found them wanting. I'll give you another example. And Matt brought this up in the closing, which I wish he brought it up earlier because I wanted to talk about it. He said, you believe a guy rose from the dead, when people say so. Here's a guy alive today who has said that he hasn't ate or drank anything in years. He's a breatharian. Do you believe that? His disciple, why would you believe someone who said Jesus rose from the dead, but not believe someone who said my yoga instructor hasn't had food in a year? Why would you believe one testimony but not the other? And I would say the qualitative nature of the evidence is different. Because the claim, I saw my rabbi rise from the dead, all that requires is for the person to be able to have been awake, aware, conscious, and know that they are talking to a person who is the person they previously knew, and that person is alive. And you can have an extended conversation with them. And if you have an extended conversation, you can reasonably affirm this person is alive. And it's the same person that I knew. It doesn't I mean, it wouldn't take you that long to figure out the person you're talking to, this guy rose from the dead, you know. But how would you testify that your yogi or whatever had not ate or drank in years? Have you followed him around 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? Because if you were to say he's never done this, you would have had to have kept tabs on him during that whole time. And so you're not really testifying to that. That these people who would say that, you have not seen the breatharian claims. You're just taking it from the individual himself, rather than from actually seeing the miracle. You're taking secondhand testimony of the miracle only from the single individual. The resurrection is different because we have people who are not expecting the miracle. We have groups of people. We have outsiders, Paul and James, who are converted by this. It's far different from like a breatharian. And I've actually looked up the breatharian claims. The one that seems to be the most plausible is there was a guy who apparently was strictly monitored, didn't eat or drink. It was only an 8-day long experiment, though. So so here's the thing. Like, I looked up in the Guinness Book of World Records. There was a guy in the 1970s. He got locked in an Austrian jail for 18 days, and the cops forgot about him. And then they found him 18 days later, and he was still alive, and he had no food or water. He like licked the walls of his cell for condensate.
Wow.
So it's like, so like these claims, like, oh, would you believe in these breatharian claims? Well, I mean, the problem is there could be people who have trained their metabolisms. They might be able to go a week without eating or drinking. But I'm not gonna help someone kill themselves by locking them in a room for a month or 2 months. But I would say that this idea that, well, you can't believe your Christianity because it would lead to these other false things. Well, no, because we can distinguish the evidence. Finally, my counter to that with Matt is, if you're worried about leading the false claims, your methodology that takes an agnosticism towards history, then it should be abandoned, because you can't even affirm that it's reasonable to believe in the crucifixion, something that all scholars accept that teach at major universities. So the argument can be turned on its head that, like Matt's methodology, it should be rejected because it leads to you rejecting true and reasonable beliefs.
Now, I want to ask this too, because I think it would be fascinating for us to get your thoughts. What do you think are the strongest objections that he offered, and then the weakest ones that he offered?
Yeah, I think the strongest objections are really from Matt, because I have read stronger objections among other atheists. I think there are stronger cases. I think the strongest case that Matt can offer is a common sense testimonial one, when you don't think about it super hard. Because I'll read in YouTube comments, somebody will say, Trent, you believe in testimony. I rose from the dead. Do you believe that? And so what Matt, this common sense, I'm not going to believe a miracle just because somebody said so. That's actually a strong rhetorical point. Because it's like, yeah, if some random YouTube commenter, you say you rose from the dead. No, I'm not going to believe that. The fallacy is in trying to say that the term testimony, I'm not going to believe just because someone said so, that all testimony is of equal value. Because the point in all of my opening is to show the testimony of the disciples is different from regular testimony or even other testimonies of the miraculous in the ancient world. So I would say that when Matt puts this forward, it's his strongest argument only rhetorically, because people are going to be like, yeah, I don't believe things just because somebody said so. I'll say, okay, do you believe Pontius Pilate was procurator of Jerusalem? Do you believe 1,000 Jews committed suicide at Masada in 72 AD? Do you believe 300 Spartans fought off 70,000 Persian soldiers at Thermopylae? And I would say there's less evidence for those things than there is, because they're secondhand historians writing 50 or 60 years later. Then the disciples then we have Paul, who has immediate knowledge of the disciples and can vouch that they had these legitimate experiences. So I guess, go ahead, Michael.
Well, I think what he would probably say is, okay, you got these 300 Spartans, but them fighting off 70,000 people, that's still within the laws of nature, but somebody being resurrected from the dead is outside of it. So it would be much more reasonable to believe the historical record of maybe the battle at Thermopylae than, the resurrection.
Sure.
What do you say to that?
Yeah, and what I would say to that is, okay, so what you're saying is, and I would say agreeing that this is a strong argument, that it's intuitive. As claims become more bizarre, we want more evidence for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is true. So that is a strong argument he's making. But I think the problem is we think that the claim's bizarreness, like the evidence has to be equally bizarre or equally miraculous or exponentially so that the bar is set so high. I just think that we need more. So I would agree we need more, but Matt has basically raised the standard so high that it never gets high. So, I mean, I'll give you an example. Like if I meet a woman and she tells me that her name is Mary Jane, I will believe that. All I need is her saying that. If she tells me that her name is Marijuana Pepsi Jackson, I'm going to be hesitant a little because I don't know people named that.
Right.
So I might want some more evidence, but it wouldn't be a ton more I would need if it was on her driver's license.
Yeah.
And actually the reason I use that example is there is a woman with that name.
No way.
There is. Her name is
I did not know this.
Marijuana Pepsi Jackson. Then she got married. I think it's Marijuana Pepsi Van Dyne or Van Dyck. And
even worse. Oh wow, I have to Google this when the show is over.
Her mom was just like, "This name will take you around the world." Just like,
yeah, it did. I mean, it made it to the RT show. So
yeah, well, so then she went on. She actually got a PhD, and so she's Dr. Marijuana Pepsi.
Oh wow!
And her dissertation was in unusual African American names. In the classroom, so she got a PhD. But here, even there, it's now here. Notice this. What's interesting here? You're willing to believe me on that without even more evidence because I've already demonstrated I'm a trusted source to you.
Right.
So it's like, and also, I have something to lose if I just make it up. If I just make this up to try to make a point about something, and somebody goes and checks, and it's like there is no Marijuana Pepsi. It's like Trent just lied about that. Why do we believe him? The apostles go through something similar. They have something. Paul has something to lose if he's lying about these resurrection appearances or other things like that. So there, like with the frequency, it's like, what, 1 in a billion, or I've never heard of that name before, but I don't need a lot more evidence. A driver's license will do. So like the testimony that Jesus was crucified, to believe that lots of people were crucified. We just need people close to the source who can say this guy, Jesus, they're close to it. But then so that Jesus rose from the dead, I might need more than just an ancient historian writing 50 years later. But if I have outsiders, groups of people who all say they saw the same thing, we don't, Gary Habermas and a guy named, last name is Bergeron, in 2015, they did a survey of the literature in PubMed on collective hallucinations, and they did not find a single occurrence of a collective hallucination, of a group of people seeing the same thing that wasn't there. Like collective hallucinations at best, people say, at best what I've found, people, sometimes some atheists will say, well, there's collective hallucinations. And I'll say, like what? The closest I get is like mass hysteria, like laughing fits that take over a whole school, for example, or one person dances and everybody starts dancing, but not like we all see the same dead guy that's come back to life. Or folie à deux, the madness. Have you ever heard of that? Folie à deux, the madness of two?
No, I don't think so.
There's a documentary you can watch. Madness of two, folie à deux, is a kind of contagious hysteria where one person thinks that people are after them, and they have a distorted view of reality, and then that hysteria will then be another person who is usually a family member or a close friend who is more suggestible, the weaker one in the group, will go along with it, and then they'll kind of absorb it. There's a video on YouTube of these two ladies. I think it's in like Sweden, maybe it's England. I think it's Sweden, and they're running in traffic. They're like running in traffic, and they think people are out to get them, and they're running away from the police, and a truck hits one of them, and it's super duper bizarre. Look it up, like Swedish ladies. I don't know. You never know what you'll find on the internet. Swedish ladies run into traffic. Ursula and Sabina Eriksson, first one that comes up. But one of the proposals for why they freaked out and started doing this is folie à deux. But we don't see something that doesn't match like the experience of the disciples, Paul, James. So for me, I would say, Matt, sorry, yeah, it's stronger that non-miraculous events. We need less testimony. And this goes back to my opening case when I said it's reasonable to believe in an unusual event only when there are no other usual explanations that present themselves. So like for unusual battles, marijuana, Pepsi, yeah, you're right. We can find it's easier to come up with usual explanations, lying, legend, things like that. But with the resurrection, I would say the usual explanations are insufficient. Now the reply, now Dillahunty has a reply to this. He calls it the Doyle fallacy. Here's also why I wish we had more rebuttal rounds, because I could have mentioned all this stuff. I'll after this, I do want to, well, even during this, I want to talk to you about how debates should be set up so that they're most effective. But this is what Dillahunty does. He says, look, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle thought that Houdini was a real magician in the sense of he'd had real magic. And so it's weird. The guy who wrote Sherlock Holmes is actually really gullible. Like he believed in fairies. He believed in, I don't know if you knew that about Doyle, but he was kind of a gullible guy. He was a spiritualist. Okay. And so Doyle said to Houdini, I think you're using real magic. And Houdini said, no, I'm not. It's just a trick. And Doyle didn't even believe him. And so Houdini said, Doyle, he jumps to the supernatural just because he can't figure out the natural. And so that's what Matt says. He'll say, you Christians, you jump to the supernatural just because you can't think of a natural explanation. And it's true. In some cases, just because you don't know the right answer doesn't mean you should jump to the supernatural. But on the other hand, I'm of this perspective. I think if we see a phenomena, we interpret it at face value unless the evidence suggests otherwise. Okay? And so we can let the phenomena present itself. We can never rule out unknown explanations we haven't come across yet. But actually, Dillahunty's Houdini example goes against him. Because why should Doyle trust Houdini when Houdini says it's just a trick? Well, because Houdini did it. If Houdini escapes from his chains, then Doyle should trust Houdini when Houdini tells him how he did it. Likewise, if Jesus escapes the grave, the disciples can trust Jesus when he says he did so through divine power. So then actually, Matt's argument, I wished he had brought it, because he brought up Houdini and stuff in other debates, like the Christian didn't respond, and then it doesn't come up in mine, well, whatever. But I can bring it up here that what seems to be a strong argument is not. And then finally, I guess the weakest, I don't know, the historical agnosticism. Like, well, we can't really, we can't really know. It's like we can though, and so I don't know if you saw anything you thought was particularly weak.
Yeah, there was a lot there, but the claim that the Christian claim to the resurrection is unfalsifiable, I just felt that was very, very weak. But I mean, you've kind of covered some arguments against that, unless you wanted to add anything else to
No,
it.
I think the idea here is if you think you can only believe things that are falsifiable, well, that's self-refuting. How could you falsify that statement that you require falsifiability? There's lots of things that we believe about the world that cannot be falsified, but we have just good evidence to believe that they're true. He tried to present an example, like, what if you found the bone box of Jesus? And hey, if there was a bone box that said Jesus of Nazareth, I'd find that interesting, but it's not a really good rebutting defeater. It doesn't show me the resurrection didn't happen. It's an oddity. But for me, what would be harder would be an undercutting defeater, something that, and just for the audience, what I mean by those terms, if let's say I make a claim that there's a Ferrari in my garage, okay? There's two ways you could defeat that. There is a Ferrari in my garage. You could have an undercutting defeater, which says there's no good reason to believe that it's true. So it'd be like, look at Trent's bank account. This guy can't afford a Ferrari. But stronger than an undercutting defeater would be a rebutting defeater. Not just there's good reasons to think it's not true, there's good reasons to think it's false. So a rebutting defeater might be open the garage, no Ferrari. Look inside. So when it comes to falsifying the resurrection, like finding Jesus's bones would be a rebutting defeater. If you had them, sure, that'd be very powerful. But it's going to be hard proving that they are Jesus's bones. Like, how are you going to do that?
Right.
How?
Right.
For me, what'd be more concerning would be an undercutting defeater, like a letter from the apostles or one of the apostles saying they had recanted. It wouldn't totally refute it, but it would dramatically strike against my confidence in the evidence I had put forward for the proposition. So I do think it's important to say, well, here's how I would realistically evaluate the evidence. And I will say that's more than what Matt offered, because Matt never said what specifically would falsify his view on the resurrection or God. He never has.
Now, you did mention something there about talking about how debates should be set up. I'm curious to hear your thoughts there.
And because you set them up all the time.
So I need to know.
Here's what's hard. Sometimes I hear people say, I don't like standard debates. I don't like William Lane Craig debates where it's like opening and rebuttal and third rebuttal. And I want to see them actually interact with each other. And I like that too. So the thing is, every debate format has pluses and minuses to it. So I think what's best is, honestly, I think what would be best is if you did like multiple debates on the same topic, but with different formats for people. Mm-hmm. So like, let's take the standard Lincoln Douglas debate. That's probably one of my favorites. Opening, rebuttals, short cross-examination periods. The benefit of that is that each speaker has a lot of time to really focus on what the other guy said. So like if I had a 7-minute rebuttal, I probably could have rebutted everything that Matt had said in his opening statement. I could have touched on every single thing that he brought up. So that is a benefit there. A con is that sometimes in the Lincoln Douglas, you talk past each other and you feel like, man, I wish these guys could just talk to each other and get to the root of their disagreement. But then let's say you do like the dialogue ones. Like, it's just like, we're going to sit down and we're going to talk to each other about what we disagree about. Like, and that was the bulk of what we did last night with Matt. Yeah, we get to some root of the disagreement, but if it's not moderated, it can kind of spiral out of hand, especially the format. Like if you have an unruly person, Lincoln Douglas has guardrails to keep them from interrupting and, really derailing it. The dialogue only really works best. Like for me, honestly, I could have a really productive conversation with Alex O'Connor because he has the temperament for that. With Matt Dillehaunty, I think we need more guardrails. So it depends on it really does depend a lot on the temperaments and the goal. But in the dialogue too, it's like when Matt and I were talking, we could only talk about like 3 or 4 things. There's so many other things that kind of got lost. So that's why I guess there's 3 formats. I'd like to get your thoughts on them. Lincoln Douglas, opening, rebuttals, short cross-examination, very structured, free-flowing dialogue, where it's just 2 guys and a timekeeper. And then one that I would call moderated dialogue, where it's like the moderator is really active in saying where the discussion goes. I would say there's pluses and minuses for all 3. And I think we just have to use them in different contexts. I don't know what you think.
I like the Lincoln Douglas model overall, but then adding just a brief period in there where there could be a free-flowing exchange.
Totally.
Provided that you have the proper temperament and somebody's not going to try to just hijack that time. But that's going to allow for speaking. And
that's what happened. Like with now, what's nice is if you notice with Matt Dillehaunty, in our cross-examination period, like I think Frad kind of stoked the fire a little bit. He's like, they can interrupt, they can be rude, which is true in cross, because you want to just get to your point. And you're allowed to do that in cross, and that's good. I got to some of my points, Matt got to his. Though I wasn't happy when I felt like Matt was like, give me a yes or no answer to a question on what I believe on testimony. It's like, come on, man. If you want to, I know you're just trying to score points, and that's fine. You're trying to score points. Then I will try to score points by just laughing because I think it's ridiculous.
I know. I thought that was ridiculous. Are you actually trying to understand what the other person has to say, or do you just want to put them in a box of a yes or no answer? Is that really what this is about, to just make them look bad? Or are you really trying to understand them and interact with them?
And I think that for a lot of people that are on the fence, and for me, when I do debates, I'm always trying to reach people who are on the fence about things. For people who are on the fence, I believe what's most important is having a gracious demeanor. The worst thing you can do is just come off as a jerk. I'd rather be like, Trent didn't have great art. I'd rather have Trent didn't have great arguments, but at least he was a really gracious guy. He was a really good guy out there, than just being an absolute jackass with somebody.
Sure.
Because then people don't want to even hear your arguments. So, which I think I was able to have both, which is of course the ideal. So, like when I was engaging him, I did ask him some tough questions in cross, but I never felt like I had to try to like box him or what he was doing with me, because when he asked me a question, I know some people in cross examination, they will talk and talk and talk to run out the clock. I hate that. And it's fine to interrupt and do that. But I told Matt, I'm like, dude, Matt, I can give you an answer in 30 seconds. I just don't want to have yes or no, because that doesn't adequately represent my view. And, if you're just out to score points, whatever. But like I asked him questions that I thought were firm, but were firm and fair. Like when he said, I can't say Jesus, it's reasonable to believe in the crucifixion because the experts say so. That's not a good argument. I then asked him, well, Matt, is it good to say you can trust the COVID vaccine because the experts say so? And I think that was not a great position he didn't want to be in, because he would use an argument like that, but then try to say medicine's different than history. Who knows? So,
by the way, the COVID vaccine, I had heard about y'all briefly talk about that, which maybe lasted 1 minute. I mean, it was just very brief comments that y'all made, but I had heard about that before the debate, before I had even seen the debate, I should say. And I'll let you take care of it. Yeah. I'm surprised my son hasn't been banging on the door. That's what's shocking me. Oh, I think you're on mute.
He gave up finally. Here, let me shut that.
Sure, no problem. I know how that is. I've had to take some breaks here, and
I just did the slide. I actually installed that slide lock a few weeks ago to
look. The lock doesn't stop him. Like I said, I mean, he'll just sit there and bang on the door until I go to a quick commercial and go take care of him.
Yeah. So you're saying the COVID vaccine?
Yeah. So as far as the COVID vaccine, I heard that y'all had a discussion about that, and if you could briefly just comment on it, because I think some people misunderstood what you were saying. You were effectively just saying those people who kind of take this position that you shouldn't get vaccinated because it's the mark of the beast. I think that's who you were interacting with in your comments. Is that correct?
Oh, I have to go back to, I don't know. It's actually what's interesting here. What I tried to do in this debate, when I'm doing debates, especially with atheists, I want to find common ground with atheists. And I think what's interesting in this debate, by the end of it, it'll be interesting to see Dillahunty's debrief. He usually does debriefs on his debates. I'd like to see his thoughts. But at the end of the debate, people said, like, Matt got a lot nicer by the end. And I don't know your perspective, but he got a lot more cordial. It wasn't as rough as before. But he said, like, he wanted me to come on the Atheist Experience, and like he seemed a lot more warm and receptive at the end. And I think he appreciated I tried to find common ground with him. Like I don't, I believe in evolution. I don't think the earth is 6,000 years old. When it comes to the COVID vaccine, my personal position on that is I think there is good evidence that it is of the safety and efficacy on par with other vaccines. I do not believe there is good evidence that it is the mark of the beast that is recorded in the book of Revelation. Right. So, since the mark appears to be a spiritual mark, not an actual physical mark. Even if it were physical, you don't get the vaccine on your right hand or your forehead, which is what it says in Revelation about the mark of the beast. So, my point was just I don't hold to those views, and I can affirm him when he wants to promote good medicine. That's why I love the book of Sirach when it says, pray to God, but also trust in the physician and give him his due. It says in Sirach 38. So, but some Christians don't like me saying I'll tell you this, Michael, a few people were very unhappy when I said as part of Common Ground that I was skeptical of the shot of Turin. So, because
that was another one, if you can briefly touch on it while you did that. Yeah.
Well, it's to find common ground, because some atheists think, oh, well, Trent only believes stuff because he's Catholic. Well, no, that's not true, because there are Catholic accounts and things in the Catholic tradition and stories that I don't accept just because they're Catholic. And this is something it's maybe controversial, but I think it's something to bring out. If we are going to present Catholicism to atheists and say that it is reasonable, at the foremost, we should never say that Catholicism obliges us to believe unreasonable things. It cannot do that. The Holy Spirit would not oblige us to. Now, it may oblige us to believe mysteries of the faith or things that human wisdom has a hard time understanding, but it won't oblige us to believe outright falsehoods. Won't do that. Now, the next row would be you're permitted. You're not obliged. You're permitted to believe the shroud is Jesus's burial cloth. You're permitted to believe these stories about these saints. You're not required, but you're just permitted to do that. But I would say to go the extra mile, if we're going to present the best faith, best thing to an atheist, I want to present to him even that, no, we don't oblige unreasonable beliefs. It's not common for Catholics to believe things that are without evidence or unreasonable. And so it's just hard for me when someone's like, well, why wouldn't I believe in this story about this saint? And I'm like, well, but it was written the first account of it is like 500 years later. It's, if you want to believe it, like we believe other fun stories, okay. But to die hard on its historicity just because it's only because it's a Catholic story. But that's exactly what Matt accuses us of. Like, you only believe it because it's Catholic. No, I believe things because of the evidence. So there's a lot of saint stories that I can't say they didn't happen, but I'm not convinced that they did happen. Or the shroud. Now, what I said was just that I lean towards being skeptical. I have not. There's books and all kinds of stuff written about the shroud, and I just say that I am skeptical of the shroud being good evidence of Jesus's resurrection. And what I would say to that is, one, I'm skeptical that it is Christ's burial cloth. There are arguments that are made that it's not, but I'm skeptical that it is a first century burial cloth. Even if it is a first century burial cloth, how do you know it's Jesus's burial cloth? And even if it is Jesus's burial cloth, how does it prove he rose from the dead? It would help prove he was buried in a tomb. That's a helpful thing for the resurrection apologetic. The only evidence that seems to show it'd be good for the resurrection is people claim the image on the shroud was caused by some kind of radiation from the resurrection itself. And I'm just very dubious of that claim, or that would show Jesus rose from the dead, as opposed to some kind of weird radiation event happened to the shroud. So for me, at the bare minimum, I would just say I'm just skeptical the shroud is a good argument that Jesus rose from the dead. But then I'm also I lean toward I'm not as persuaded, but I will say I have not done like an exhaustive month-long study on the shroud, because my belief in the resurrection doesn't stand or fall on the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin. I was just trying to find common ground with other atheists to say, look, I'm not convinced by this either, but there still is good evidence for me to believe in this thing. I don't know if that makes sense.
Oh, it does. And I share that sentiment. I mean, I haven't looked too much into the shroud, but there are things like that, pious traditions and things like that we're not obligated to believe, that I might question here and there. So I totally get where you're coming from. Yeah. Chris Isley asks a question, and by the way, thank you for the super chat. He says, how can eyewitness testimony be tossed away when human courts of law even accept this kind of testimony as a form of evidence?
Yeah, here's what's interesting. So what Matt, and this came up in Matt's opening statement that I wanted to rebut. He throws out this line that, well, eyewitness testimony is not reliable. And that's only true in certain conditions. Eyewitness testimony is unreliable when it's in a brief encounter among strangers who are of different races and the other person has a weapon. So like, it's sad, like if a white person, let's say if a white person is mugged by a black person who has a gun, it's not uncommon for there to be a false eyewitness identification of another black person in the lineup because you've met all the criteria. He doesn't know the person. It was a brief encounter. When there's a weapon, you're looking at the weapon more than the person. And if they're a different race, you have a harder time identifying the person. And so that leads to false identifications. None of that is the case with identifying Jesus. Now, so in allowing eyewitness testimony in court, what Matt has said before in his debates, he says, like, the resurrection would not stand up in a court of law. I'll say, well, okay, because the court of law is really strict. As I said in the debate, it's geared towards actually not punishing the innocent rather than finding out who did it. But even still, he'll say you don't convict people. He's said this in previous debates. You can't convict someone if you have no body, no murder weapon, and just somebody saying, I saw him kill that guy. but that's actually false. That's rarer, but there was a case in a former Delaware district attorney or attorney general. Guy's name was Thomas Capano. He murdered his wife, and he was convicted, even though there was no murder weapon and no body. That the eyewitness testimony said he murdered his wife, put her in a cooler, went 50 miles out to sea, and dumped the body. And the eyewitness testimony of the accomplice, who has stuff to risk and even coming forward in the first place, and the other elements, it does happen. And there's other examples. They're rare in criminal justice, obviously, but it does happen. We use eyewitness testimony when the person knows the person and is in a decent position to recognize them. Well, and actually, I was going to cite up in the debate. Some people will say, yeah, but what about, the Gospels are written decades later? How is eyewitness testimony supposed to hold up? It deteriorates. Not necessarily. There was a 2005 study done on elderly Danes, from Denmark. And they asked them, what was it like on the day when Denmark was liberated from the Nazis? And these people, 60 years later, could get small details right. They knew the weather that day, on the exact day it happened, what the weather was like. It was seared into their memories. Psychologists call this flashbulb memories. And those Danes who were involved in the liberation movement had more vivid memories than ones who were not. So if you were involved in this social movement in the midst of these things happening, the memories crystallized for 50 or 60 years. And so right there, that's a good template for the apostles or the apostolic men like Mark and Luke to be able to provide valuable testimony even decades later. And I would say it's not 50 or 60 years. I would say the Gospels are mostly written between 55 and 65 AD.
Now, but by the way, I saw Seethy C in the chat earlier. He says, "Can I get a shout out? I'm a patron of Pints with Aquinas, R&T, and Trent Horn."
Hey, the triple threat. Thank you so much for your patronage.
Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to shout him out, and then thank you for the super chat. Michael asks, "What does Trent think about Marian apparitions?"
Well, I haven't done exhaustive surveys of these either. Some of them I am historically skeptical of because the accounts are comparatively late. And there are some Marian accounts where the original witnesses, I think there were 2 girls who were involved who said that they made it up to get out of school that day. So there are some I'm skeptical of. There are others that I think are extremely good. Probably the best one, honestly, is the appearance of Fatima. I mean, we have newspaper accounts talking about this right after it happened, telling details about puddles drying up from the strange atmospheric event that went on. And we have a lot of testimonies from something that was not that far back in history. I would almost say, the miracle of Fatima I think the evidence is almost on par with the evidence for the resurrection, even in its reliability, the eyewitnesses involved. It's now there are objections, but I think it's something I would consider very strong. So there's a continuum on the apparitions. What's funny, and I thought about writing an essay on. Every time I do an interview, I'm always like, I've thought about writing a book or an essay on, and sometimes it does materialize. I was going to write one about Protestants who provide indirect evidence for Catholicism, and one of them is some atheists, when they argue against Protestant apologists like Mike Licona or William Lane Craig on the resurrection. What they do is they say, William Lane Craig says Jesus rose from the dead. By those same standards, you could believe that Mary has appeared to people. The Virgin Mary has. Do you believe that? And in Mike Licona's book on the resurrection, he has a footnote about this. And he says, well, I have a theological bias against Marian apparitions. But based on the evidence, I'm not prepared to discount that they happened. And so it's interesting that the atheists, when they try to pick, here's the closest thing to a resurrection you don't believe in, it's actually a part of Catholic piety and tradition, which I find to be really fascinating.
Yeah. Now, Enrique asks a question here. Is it fair for atheists to say biblical evidence is biased and therefore should not count as evidence that Jesus rose from the dead? Kind of touching on what we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. And what I would say is the problem with that is all evidence is biased. Everyone has a bias. We should not think there's a magical group of people who are not biased. It's just not true. When it comes to, like, let's say the resurrection, Jesus rose from the dead, and you're looking at sources. The sources are already going to have a major bias. They either affirm Jesus rose from the dead or they don't. So you already have, because to affirm Jesus rose from the dead is to dramatically change your life. So, I mean, you're already going to have a bias one way or the other. The question is, what does the evidence say? Now, also, especially like with ancient history, there's this misconception that the New Testament authors are like these biased people who they're like used car salesmen. They only want to sell their product. And that's what Matt Dillehaunty said in the debate. Like, these people just want to sell a product. You can't trust them. Like, the New Testament authors are like I try to compare them to like sleazy preachers or snake oil salesmen. They're trying to sell you something, so you can't trust what they have to say. First, on that, I would say, do you think let's say a parent whose child was killed at Sandy Hook Elementary, who writes a book saying the shooting did happen and was not a conspiracy, or a survivor of the Holocaust saying the Holocaust did happen, here's what happened. Well, are they biased? Of course they are. They're absolutely biased, but that does not take away from their ability to write about the event and faithfully communicate evidence. The same is true for the apostles. Just because someone passionately believes something, it doesn't mean they're incapable of sharing evidence. Number two, there's this misconception that, the New Testament authors are just trying to sell something, and other ancient historians are just like working in a library, and they are just on the pursuit of truth. I shall write down what has happened under Tiberius, and that's all they care about. But they're biased too. Like, our major sources, the other major source for the time of Jesus is Flavius Josephus. And Josephus was a member of the Jewish Revolution, and instead of committing suicide like other soldiers did at the Battle of, it was like Yatfa. It was
I thought it was Masada.
He wrote about Masada.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, he wrote about the 1,000 soldiers who committed suicide at Masada. But I think he was a part of 40 people who all decided to take their lives at Yatfa.
Okay.
I believe it was a smaller group there, and he was the one who survived that. And then he became a Roman historian with a patron in the Flavian family. So it's like he has a bias when he writes about Rome and about Roman officials. And the Tacitus does too. Anybody who is writing at that time, their bills are paid by somebody higher up. That's just how it goes. So of course they're going to have a bias. The question is, they have a bias, but let's use objective standards of evidence to see whether their position is a reliable one or not.
There was this other one here from Giovanni. What are your thoughts on Jesus as a failed prophet, or failed with his predictions? Do you think that this works against the resurrection? Well, did he fail is the question. So
right. And I would say no, he is not. That's a common one, that people would say he's a millenarian prophet, that he was proclaiming the end of the world, and that did not happen. But I would say that Jesus's predictions, interwoven his predictions, especially I think it's Matthew 24, where he talks about the destruction of what seems like the universe. I would say he's making apocalyptic predictions both about the end of the world, because Jesus is talking about when he returns, but interspersed within there, woven with it, are predictions of the destruction of Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that many of the things that seem to be cosmic or like about the end of the physical world are actually talking about the temple, because for first century Jews, the temple was not just another building.
Mm-hmm.
It basically was the universe.
Correct.
It was God's dwelling place. It was the house of God itself. It was like a microcosm of the universe. So inside of it, there was decorations of the stars and the planets and things embroidered on the temple curtain. So to say I saw the stars fall, for example, is another way of saying the temple has been destroyed. Not the world, but a world has been destroyed, what Jesus is talking about. And so what's interesting here is that Brant Petrie, in his book, The Case for Jesus, has a lot of good work on this to show the authenticity of Jesus's predictions. What's interesting is that some people will say, well, Jesus, like the Gospels had to be written after 70 AD because Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple, as if that had to be something gospel writers wrote back into the text. Well, first, there were people who were predicting it. There was another prophet, I think his name was Jesus, that Josephus talks about, who was talking about the temple being destroyed. You didn't, I mean, anybody with a brain could be like, there's these Roman garrisons waiting out here, and there's always something bad happening. You didn't have to be that bright to predict something like this could happen. But in the accounts, like Jesus says things like, pray when Jerusalem's destroyed, pray it does not happen in winter. Pray it shall not be on a Sabbath. If you're writing after the fact, why would you have Jesus say these things when the temple was destroyed in around July, August of 70? It would only make sense if he is telling these things to people because it hasn't happened yet. He predicted it beforehand. So, no, I would say that, the idea, no, he's not a failed prophet. But number two, if Jesus rose from the dead, it's not like, oh, he didn't, all the evidence of the resurrection doesn't count because, look, he made a mistake here. Well, I would go backwards. I'd say, actually, because he rose from the dead, this must not be a mistake. We must be reading it incorrectly. So I guess that's how I would look.
It vindicates what he taught. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Now, Lewis has a comment here. Write that Fatima book.
Well, there is a book on, the book would be on like indirect Protestant evidence for Catholicism. So that it would be more than just on Fatima. But there is a book. Joan Carroll Cruz has a few different books on miracles. I think she has one called Meet the Witnesses. And it has a lot of stuff on the miracle of the sun at Fatima. She has a lot of stuff on other miracles as well. Jacqueline Duffy is a Canadian physician who ended up doing she was an agnostic who did medical reviews for cases and then later found out they were from the Vatican and then saw all of these miracles of the saints and published them in a book called Medical Miracles. She was later inducted in the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame. So Jacqueline Duffy, Medical Miracles, Joan Carroll Cruz, a lot of good books on Eucharistic miracles, saints, Fatima. I would recommend those resources.
I want to give you a chance, wrapping it up here, to address anything else that you felt that needed to be addressed about the debate that we haven't discussed so far. Any other loose threads?
No, I don't think. I think we covered everything. I think what's important for people to remember, it's like when it comes to debates, some people say to me like, Trent, Trent, why would you do a debate? What if somebody watches it and agrees with Matt Dillehaunty? Like, well, that's a risk to take. But here's the thing. If I stick my head in the sand and pretend like atheists aren't out there, that person could still come across them. I'd rather have that person listen to Matt Dillehaunty in my debate than listen to a Matt Dillehaunty talk or watch an atheistic video on YouTube. It's not like you're going to be able to protect people from these arguments. I feel like they're going to come across the arguments one way or another. So it's like, I'd rather have them come across it, at least in the context of a debate, to show that we are aware of them and have responses to them. My purpose in debates, though, another criticism is, well, Trent, you can't, it's a circus. And it was a bit more of a circus with Matt Dillehaunty, with his attitude. But it's showmanship. And I'm like, well, no, I agree that it's not as sober as just doing an academic anthology where we write essays and put them together. But maybe like a few people will read that. I do debates partly because they are entertainment, because I want to get people to think about these questions. For me, the purpose of a debate is not to end the controversy. It's to bring the controversy to light, to get other people to look into it. And so that is why I do them. I will continue to do them. I will continue to mentor other people to help them do them. Because one thing that is, Michael, has been disheartening for me. That's why I love what you guys do at R&T. Like, seriously. There are so many Protestants out there who will do debates on atheism, debates on the resurrection, debates on Christianity. And there are some Catholics who will do, Catholic debates are way more popular like back in the 90s. But I feel like as Catholics, we have just totally slacked in this area. I mean, the closest, like the only other Catholic I know who's done a debate on the resurrection, William Albrecht did one with you guys, with Dan Barker, and that was great.
Yep.
But I'm like, when I look everywhere else, it's like tumbleweeds. And it's, what's hard for me is like, I know there are some, and here's the sad part. There are some Catholics who do like ministry and media work. And like, they get offended if other Catholics are like infringing on their brand. And I have the exact opposite. I would be elated. I would be absolutely elated if I heard there was a debate on the resurrection and I was like, hey, do you need me to do that? Like, oh, we got this other guy. He's really, really good. I'd be like, oh, thank goodness there are people to carry this torch and to go and and do this kind of apologetic work, whether it's debates or dialogues or writing books or engaging people. It's like when Jesus said, the harvest is plenty, but the laborers are few. That's what I wanted to grow. And at least in doing the debates indirectly, I hope I can model for other people how to do them. And I'm glad you have a forum to show people where we see them and we can engage the substance of critics' arguments.
In fact, since you brought it up, William has one, I believe it's coming up next Saturday. I'll have to look back at the calendar, but it's going to be on RNT, and he'll be debating the resurrection. I think it's with John Loftus. I'll need to go back and look at the calendar, but because he has another one he's going to be doing as well, so I might be
Indiana Jones. Good times. Yeah, he always wears that. He always wears that hat in all of his pictures. Loftus and I had him on my podcast for a discussion about miracles. Yeah. And it was actually interesting because I actually got him to admit you could prove miracles with testimony by the end of the conversation, even though at the beginning he said that you couldn't. But Loftus is he's an interesting guy. Have fun with that one.
He was on the show. We had a debate, him and William, way back, maybe 2 years ago. It was when we first started out.
Yeah.
Looking forward to that one as well. But again, Trent, I appreciate you coming on and doing this. This was excellent, very insightful to hear your views after the fact, and of course, challenging some of the things that you heard during the debate that maybe didn't get a chance to address.
Yeah, and I do think it's important, though. I'm glad we do these debriefs, and I do want people to know, like, my intention whenever I do a debrief is not like to do the debate over. Sure. Like I've seen some people who will they do a debate and then they play the debate and then offer commentary on play-by-play. I don't think that's good. Like, the guy's not there. It's not fair, but I think it's totally legitimate to say, and Matt Dillehaunty does this too with his own debates. He'll talk about what he thought about them. And I think it's totally fair to okay, here's strong points, weak points, interesting points, things I might have done differently. And it's good to reflect so that, honestly, for me, I like doing these debriefs. I want to learn from them because I want to continue to glorify God in doing debates and dialogues and to get better. The only thing that's hard, like what I do, Michael, is it's a very public learning curve. When it's like you want to share the gospel and do public debates and dialogues. And when you make mistakes, everybody sees. And it's like, hey, I'm only human, and we try to grow in that area. But I want other people, if other people can learn from my mistakes, there's a mistake right there. Glory to God if they can do that. And things that go well, imitate it. They don't go well, make something better.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you for coming on. This was excellent. I appreciate it. You're welcome on anytime. In fact, I'll try, if you're available, I'll try to see if I can maybe set up a debate between yourself and maybe another individual on RNT if you're willing and have time in the future. So,
yeah, that would be fun. I'm sure we could find something fun to do with that. Absolutely.
Indeed. Well, once again, thank you for coming on. And everybody else, thank y'all for watching. As you know, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to RNT. Also check out Trent Horn's podcast. Again, I'm going to put links there in the description so y'all can just click on those.
Sorry, and I have to have one last disclaimer.
Yeah.
I appreciated Matt Dillehaunty debating with him. I don't want anything that I've said to be even though I am critical of his positions, I don't want people to think that I have any kind of animosity towards him. And I would, if the format was appropriate, I would be happy to, engage in an exchange with him again. But overall, I was happy with how, we were able to at least engage each other.
Yeah, I think it was very profitable and beneficial. So I thought, the objective had been accomplished, and you did very well and conducted yourself very well. So, but again, everybody, thank y'all for watching. Again, like, subscribe, share this on your social media, on your Facebook, your Twitter, and of course, check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology. Till next time, God bless you all.